okay today. This is a Monday. Mondays are always a little rough because you realize that you have a week ahead of you. Nevertheless, I am here. I'm hopefully that I can assuage that within the context of the time frame to which we are here together. I am Jamarl Thomas. I'm your host of the Progressive Soapbox. So let's do this one. Bill Maher. Originally, I was going to do this show last night, and I started to waver on whether to do the show. And my energies, for the most part, weren't up to snuff in order to pull those shows out at like 2 in the morning. So I get up this morning, and as I started thinking through the story, I have certain considerations. There are multiple considerations when I think about doing this story, and I wasn't sure. It was this thing of whether my audience is going to care. Yes, my audience is going to have a perspective on it. But then I started to think more about the needle in regards to how we deal with minority communities moved when minorities communities started to speak up, and the people who were allied with those communities joined in and also started to speak up. Not saying anything about it, meaning just because you realize that people may agree with you on a topic, you still want to put your own stamp on the topic. I want to put my stamp on this topic, and I want to rebuke this particular statement by Bill Maher because I think it's a massive jump of the shark. Take a look at this video, and then let's talk about it after. But Bill Maher is talking about Israel and Palestine. Now, this started off with a conversation on Ilhan and whether or not her comments were anti-Semitic. Now, people take her comments as being anti-Semitic almost as a given, which I find it to be amazing when her comments was criticizing a lobby. It was criticizing a lobby, but criticism of an Israeli lobby is of all of a sudden anti-Semitism. But whatever. They're talking about it, but it moves into this issue of Israel and Palestine. Listen to what Bill Maher says here, because I hold these comments in the same light as I hold Trump's comments about Mexicans being rapists and drug dealers. And I'll explain what I mean. That looks weird. Okay, I'll explain what I mean after this. I'll let it play.
I hope she comes on this show and we can talk, and she and I would agree about very little about Israel and Palestine. We would agree that Palestinians are victims, but not of Israel.
Right.
They're victims of other Palestinians, unfortunately. I hope she...
That's an amazing statement. That's an amazing statement. I heard him say that, and I that's a stunning statement. I've been to Israel. I've just said it before. I've been to Israel, and I've had conversations with Israelis about Israel-Palestinian relations and the conflict therein. I've had conversations when I didn't want to have conversations. Just me being an American somehow spurred this on. Actually, I did say something about Palestine, and they kind of brought themselves into the conversation. I've sat there and talked for hours about this with them, not necessarily attacking, but bringing up particular points. They wouldn't even have Bill Maher's perspective. Meaning, not even they will go so far as to say that the only problem the Palestinians are having are other Palestinians, meaning they're being victimized by other Palestinians. I engaged this issue from an African American perspective. Meaning, people have varying perspectives depending upon their experience within the context of a country. White, black, Hispanic, gay, lesbian, straight, woman, across the board. All of those people will have a very specific perspective just because of, of various factors within the cultural context to which they exist. So I engage this from the standpoint of African American. And to put this in perspective more, I think my perspective is a little bit more honest than Bill Maher's. In this country, African Americans were subjugated, meaning people like me were held into bondage and forced to work. After that, those people were essentially thrown into a society with nothing and told to figure it out. While simultaneously, the society tries to essentially encase this notion that this group is inferior, this group is, somehow less in value than the other people within the society itself, and keep that context within the society for years. Now, things in society may have changed, but let's be very clear that the echoes of that still remain. And as the society goes further, and you have the younger culture, and as those societies propagates or those generations propagates, that echo will get less. But that echo is still there. And within the context of that echo, I look out And I look at what I see, regardless of what mainstream media propagates, because this United States, for the most part, is in lockstep with Israeli policy. There is a lot of influence within the United States government itself, and media tends to go along with the perspective of the United States government on these issues of foreign policy. In this very specific case, though, mainstream media usually propagates a narrative that is pro-Israel as a blank check. I don't look at it that way. I look at it as one group is militarily occupying another group as it appropriates more land, breaking international law as it does so, and breaks international law in regards to allowing people to return to their land after a war. That's the way I look at this. Not to mention, one non-country that's being occupied, the occupiers in this case have almost like a blank check loyalty or a blank check affiliation with the United States, which allows them to propagate that in the face of what would be considered war crimes under normal circumstances, and in the face, again, of flagrantly breaking international law. This also goes with this idea of protests where people were being shot, hundreds of people being killed, thousands being shot. And this even goes back further within my memory of, in one case, 2,000 people being killed as Israeli soldiers goes in, essentially does somewhat of a cleansing of the area. Let's be very clear. People responding to violence within the context of oppression is not the same thing as people committing that violence to oppress. There's a difference in those things. There is somewhat of a moral difference in the value of the violence, or let me say it this way. Whether it's productive is the second question, meaning whether the violence in the context of pushing back on an oppression is productive or not is the second question, or whether it's morally right or morally just to be able to protect your own and your land against invaders or, again, oppressive militaristic forces. Would Bill Maher be so quick to wag the finger at French resistance fighters pushing back against the Nazi occupation? I strongly suspect that he would not. In fact, even my perspective, like the perspective that I'm giving here from the perspective of an African American, even that is a little bit askew from a historical context. The closer perspective of this are the Native Americans. A white European population comes to America, and as it comes to America, it pushes westward. And in pushing westward, it cleanses out the population, creating laws and legal structures that allow them to do the cleansing while simultaneously calling itself a government. The Brits didn't want to push further than that. The American colonies, however, did. And after the Revolutionary War, pushed further, pushed westward, ever westward, expansion. And that's what took place. We conquered the United States, not to mention taking parts of Mexico. That's what we did when we got to this country. I put to you that the same thing is taking place in Israel-Palestine. White European settlers build a colony and expands. In this case, you have white European Jews, atheistic Jews, that were looking for a place to expand to go to. They wanted their homeland. After World War I, the Brits, who for the most part were masters of the world after World War I, gave them somebody else's land. This kicked into high gear after the Second World War. Now look, I understand, and we need to be clear. This wasn't the promised land. That was like they were looking into other areas on where to, you could say, put this colony, but this wasn't necessarily the promised land, even though that this was again coded in all of these kind of propaganda. Other people were there, and other people resisted the expansion that was taking place by this secondary group. And if looking at it again from a larger historical perspective, this is what Palestine was. Then 1947 partition. Further still. What does this look like? If you were living around the time during North American expansion, where the Americans were going essentially expanding westward, What would this look like? The laws, the legal structure, all that stuff started to conform and to allow the appropriation of more and more land and to make this okay under their own laws. That's exactly what the United States did. That's essentially what Israel is doing. There is a link between the two countries, not just from the standpoint of a lobby or not just from the standpoint of religious zealots who think that this is going to bring the end times, but also in just the way the country propagated itself and came a country in and of itself. People resisted. And in that resistance, they were put into reservations, or in this case, they were put into an open-air ghetto that is what's left of Palestine. Just saying. An atrocity committed upon the Jews doesn't necessarily give any level of moral right to commit an atrocity on somebody else. We need to be very clear on that. If Bill Maher wants to blame Hamas for some of the issues that plague Palestinians, I would agree with him on that. Fair enough. But the idea that the entirety of the blame lies on Palestinians when they're being militarily occupied is somewhat insane. Fact of the matter is, Hamas is an infinitely foreseeable outcome to a group that's being oppressed. Any group that's being oppressed have elements that started to get more right-wing or more radicalized just from the standpoint of the oppression. Essentially, people create their monsters. In our standpoint in the United States, we had Malcolm X. We had the Black Power movement in this case. You had groups that were trying to get more militarily armed in order to push back against violent resistance. The same thing happened here. You had just two sides of that from the standpoint of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. It was more so the King way that eventually won out in the path that we took in this country. I'm making a point that it is infinitely foreseeable that people who are being subjugated will push back against that subjugation. I don't understand why Bill Maher is unclear on that. The last point, my real position here, I just want this to end. Like, I don't have a dog in the hunt from the standpoint of one side or the other. It's, I want this to end. One side in this case is nuclear weapons. One side in this case has the support of a superpower. One side is armed to the teeth by that superpower. One side has declared themselves a Jewish state, which makes them, for all intents and purposes, an apartheid state. And we've supported them in this. Now, one side has such an overwhelming advantage between the other sides, and the idea that you're calling this a conflict, it's a conflict. But let's be very clear that one side is appropriating more land in the face of international law. One side doesn't allow the right of return, meaning people to be able to go back to their land. And the question becomes, what's the resolution to this? Like, how do you resolve this issue when all of the incentives for one of the sides in this that is supported by that superpower, that is protected from international law, protected from these things of war crimes by that superpower? What is the outcome when all the incentives go in the direction of we do what we want because we don't have any consequences for the things that we do? They don't want to allow a state of one man, one vote because they want this to be a Jewish state. Now, this doesn't represent all Jews, so on that front, it's somewhat of a fail, meaning that the point of it is to try to give this idea that's representing all Jews. So on that point, it's somewhat of a fail. Not all Jews agree with the way that they're appropriating land and all this other stuff, and not with the right-wing government that's in power. So that's the first point. The second point is it's a state. Regardless of what they call themselves, at the end of the day, it's a state. And trying to hide yourself from criticism by saying we're a Jewish state, so anybody that criticizes you is anti-Semitic, is nonsense. It is a state. It can be criticized like any other state. Bill Maher has a bee in his bonnet about Muslims. But this issue is not necessarily about Jews and Muslims. This issue is about land. Again, I show you this map. However, they coat the language of the struggle. Ultimately, this issue is about land. They want their land back. They want to return to their land. They want to not be subjugated. It makes all the sense in the world if you're not looking at it from the perspective that Palestinians are all utter blame for the issues associated with Palestinians. It's utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense. How do you end this? Like, I guess I'm asking, what is the solution when a two-party state at this point is almost untenable, and B, a one-party state, meaning having one man, one vote, again, is untenable because they wanted to have a Jewish state, and would make the argument that allowing such a thing would essentially no longer allow it to be a Jewish state. What is the solution when the other solutions are no longer applicable? I'm asking this question in earnest. This is not any kind of, sub thing. I asked the question in earnest. I guess my final point is this. Israel makes this argument that it has a right to exist. No country has a right to exist. They're legal fictions. I say that about the United States. I say that about Britain. I say that about France. I say that about any country. No country has a right to exist. The Soviet Union went belly up at some point. The Ottoman Empire went belly up at some point. The Austro-Hungarian Empire went belly up at some point. Those countries still exist. The people are still there, meaning when the Soviet Union went belly up, Russia was still there. The argument that we have a right to exist and all this other stuff doesn't really apply. It's a state. It's a legal fiction. I understand their cultural identity and all this other stuff wrapped into it. Fair enough. I understand that people who are born into a particular side, being Palestinians or Israelis, are brought up into a culture and they're stuck with the baggage of their forefathers and their ancestors. Fair enough. It is behooving, however, to us to look at this in somewhat of an objective way and call people like Bill Maher bullshit and push back against this narrative, that Bill Maher is pushing here, that the allegiance to the Israeli side is right and that gives it a blank check. No, any country can be criticized, including our foreign policy in relation to that country. And fact of the matter is the arguments or the massive attacks that have taken place on Omar or Corbyn, but in this country, Omar gives an opportunity to push back on those attacks, which elements of the left have been doing. This is the door that you got to walk through if you would really want to get any change within regards to policy shifts in the way we engage with Israel. And I'll tell you this. There is no way to resolve this issue in a fair way towards the Palestinians as long as the United States keeps its policy with Israel in the way that it is. There can be no resolution. How can you have a resolution when all incentives are for Israel just to continue to appropriate more land because there's no consequence to the appropriation of more land? Who cares if it breaks international law, if international law doesn't do anything about the fact that they're breaking international law? My very blunt point is this. Trying to find a solution to this, trying to find some way out, means that there needs to be a change in how we engage with Israel, especially if it's going to completely be unfair to the Palestinians whose land, let's be honest, has been appropriated and taken and have put them in grossly inhospitable conditions. And by the way, the worse conditions that people are in, the more agitated that those people get. And yeah, they do go to the right-wing elements when they feel like they need to be protected. And in the case where you have a military occupation, I guarantee you those people will feel they need to be protected. Bill Maher may want to blame Hamas, but I suggest that Bill Maher look further into this issue before just going with this blank check to Israel and that Palestinians' issues are only of Palestinians' origins. So I really hated this comment. Really hated this comment. And then later on, I hear Bill Maher make this point of saying, well, maybe Omar is racist or anti-Semitic. Well, maybe if Omar is anti-Semitic, then you've supported terrorists. How about that? If anybody remembers, Bill Maher was on a show called Politically Incorrect. I used to watch that show. Bill Maher comes out and gives some support to the terrorists, essentially saying the terrorists were brave indeed. It's a brave thing to get on an airplane. They shut his shit down. And ever since they shut his show down, he's had this thing about free speech, only because he was directly affected by issues that he considered to be free speech. A person criticizes a lobby, something that literally gives money or shuffles money around in order to give the candidates to get support. Oil and gas, healthcare, doesn't matter what the lobby is. It deals with special interests. It just so happened in this particular case, that lobby that we're talking about is a lobby that represents the interests of the Israeli government. He looks at her tweets and says, well, maybe she's anti-Semitic. If she's anti-Semitic, you're a supporter of terrorism. How about that? Just saying. And Netanyahu's about to get indicted, so that's awesome. All right, I'm going to... one point. Somebody says maybe Bill Maher is straight up racist. So here's the thing. When I look at this, I look at this from the same perspective as Trump and Russia. When Donald Trump comes out, not Trump and Russia, when Donald Trump comes out and says Mexicans are rapists or drug dealers, I ask the question, what is the perspective that's necessary for you to come away with the assessment that millions of people just so happen to be racists or rapists and drug dealers? It's a fucking ridiculous perspective to take. And I ask, what is psychology of the individual that comes out with that particular assessment? I have to ask the same thing here with Bill Maher. What is the quality of the individual that looks at this issue of human rights abuses, left and right, and say that the only trouble with Palestinians are Palestinians, as if Israel has nothing to do with it? That's utter nonsense. Even people who would make the argument of, well, look, we have to do these things in order to, Israel has the right to protect itself. But understand, they're making their argument of Israel has a right to protect itself because it's doing heinous things. Not even they would take this argument that the only issue associated with Palestinians are Palestinians. That's utter nonsense. That's utter nonsense. All right, I'll end this. I just thought this was insane comment. Let's see, let me check Streamlabs. Having your cake. Israel is internationally recognized as a country, not a religion. Exactly. By calling it a country of Jews, it's attempting to gain religious protection it didn't earn. No country has a right to exist, especially when committing war crimes. Yes. And the wild part about it, this tweet was psychic. This was a psychic tweet. Because this tweet came out 3/10/2019, and I hadn't even put this one up to do yet. So good job on having your cake, I want a reading at one point. But no, this annoyed the shit out of me. But you're right. It's not a religion. It's a country. It's a legal fiction like any other country is a legal fiction. Any country can be wiped away from the face of the earth. The people will still be there, but any country can be wiped away because they're just legal fictions. It's a name on a pad. People start to, get accustomed to it, and they start to attach themselves to it, but ultimately it's a name on a pad. It can be wiped away. People will still be there. The country could change. If Israel allowed Palestinians to vote, the Jews will be a group in that country, just like the Palestinians will probably be a political group in the country, and they will make their political case. Their issue with this is that they will no longer be, quote unquote, Israel, an apartheid state. They will be a state that would have multiple interests. They don't want that. They want to have their own state. My point is, any country can change. But this idea of a right to exist? Oh, God, no. And you certainly don't have a right to commit war crimes. You certainly don't have a right to kill protesters or shoot protesters. We're talking about Venezuela. If you're talking about a humanitarian crisis, look at what's taking place in Israel and Palestine. I've been there. There is a vast difference. Israel looks like little America. Palestine looks like, most of it doesn't have clean water. So let's, put it in perspective. I'm going to end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.